Many theists flock to apologetic content not so much for enlightenment but rather reassurance. Notice how apologists almost always are flashing a smile, presenting themselves in a certain polished manner, and insisting on calling their own doctor but failing to do the same for heretics.
Today we're talking about Carl Sagan. I've got Dr. William Lane Craig.
But there's more to the show than just smiles and reverence. Apologists are masters at subtly undermining the credibility of their critics. They're not just defending their faith, they're trying to make any objection or criticism seem less potent, less significant. It's about controlling the narrative, steering the conversation in a way that obfuscates and diminishes the impact of the criticism. And if they can achieve this before a criticism has even been leveled, then all the better. The flock watching will hear but not listen, and walk away reassured of their convictions. And what you're about to witness is a solid example of this very art, from no other than Dr. William Lane Craig.
It's always kind of cringy when you come up against that.
Now, this is a continuation of Bill and Cameron's epic takedown of Carl Sagan. If you'd like to see my first response, then you can find the video linked below.
He gets asked, do I believe in God? And then he kind of makes a point about which version of God are you talking about. So let's get to this clip here.
I'll say another word. The word God covers an enormous range of different ideas. And you recognize that in the way you phrase the question. Running from an outsized, light-skinned male with a long white beard sitting in a throne in the sky and tallying the fall of every sparrow, for which there is no evidence. To my mind, if anybody has some, I sure would like to see it. To the kind of God that Einstein or Spinoza talked about, which is very close to the sum total of the laws of the universe. Now, it'd be crazy to deny that there are laws in the universe, and if that's what you want to call God, then of course God exists. And there are all sorts of other nuances. There is, for example, the deist God that many of the founding fathers of this country believed in, although it is a secret whose name may not be spoken in some circles, a roi fainéant, a do-nothing king, the God who creates the universe and then retires, and to whom praying to is sort of pointless. He's not here. He went somewhere else. He had other things to do. Now, that's also a God. So when you say, do you believe in God? If I say yes or if I say no, you have learned absolutely nothing.
So there's Carl hitting the nail on the head. He's conveying that without a clear definition of what God means, simply asking someone whether they believe in God is too vague. It's like asking if they're interested in films.
If I say yes or if I say no, you have learned absolutely nothing.
And this isn't just a fair point, it's a crucial one. We don't even need to go into the myriad interpretations of God across different religions to exemplify it. We can stick to mere Christianity alone. Take the doctrine of hell. The majority of Christians, historically and today, believe in a loving God who nonetheless condemns people like Carl to eternal damnation. This portrayal of God alone paints a very specific and, in my view, incompatible picture with a truly loving deity. And so, if your God, like most Christians throughout history, upholds this doctrine, then that's going to significantly impact the probability I'd assign to such an evil being existing. And here's the thing, the affirmation of just this one doctrine illustrates Carl's point, and with it the need to clarify when we talk about God. It's not a one-size-fits-all term. Different interpretations of God can vary so wildly that they are effectively discussing entirely different entities. Now then, let's turn our attention to our apologists. What do they make of Carl's desire for clarity?
When you say, do you believe in God? If I say yes or if I say no, you have learned absolutely nothing.
Okay, yeah. The more I listen to Carl say, and I'll sort of summarize what he just said in just a moment, but as I was listening to like these initial clips when I started to play this video, I was like, what point is he even trying to make here? It's a very long-winded attempt at making a very basic point that, I mean, nowadays, as someone who's entered into apologetics and philosophy as of like a decade ago, there's all sorts of attempts in the literature right now on how to define God, how evaluating God's attributes. You got Richard Swinburne's Coherence of Theism. You got all sorts of attempts at explaining, what God is like. And it was just kind of strange to hear this one.
So there we have it, my fellow apes. Cameron's a bit baffled by Carl's eloquence, wondering just what the hell he's on about.
What point is he even trying to make here?
Cameron then complained about Carl taking ages to express a very simple point.
It's a very long-winded attempt at making a very basic point.
Which isn't at all, in any way, going to be ironic regarding his input in this video. Cameron proceeded to remind us of how informed he is.
That, nowadays, as someone who's entered into apologetics and philosophy as of like a decade ago, there's all sorts of attempts in the literature right now on how to define God.
But while Cameron may have read all sorts of apologetic content, the audience Carl is speaking to almost certainly haven't. And so it's important that he communicates clearly, which, Cameron, is his entire point.
I haven't really paid very close attention to.
But you see, while Carl delved into the nuances of different concepts of God, spelling out why these differences are of relevance, Cameron just name-dropped Richard Swinburne's The Coherence of Theism, as if a book title alone illustrates the same point. Imagine if Carl did this to the audience. Do you believe in God? Well, there is all sorts of literature, like Richard Swinburne's The Coherence of Theism. If Carl did this, do you really think that his point would be clearer? However, in terms of optics and narrative control, we can appreciate what's happening here. They're portraying Carl as struggling to express a very simple point, which makes him out to be ill-informed and uninsightful.
Kind of strange to hear this one. But so to sort of summarize what he just said here, he said, the bearded man in the sky has no evidence. He says, and then you compare that to the Einsteinian, Spinozian concept, which is the sum total of the laws of nature in the universe. And then he says, of course the laws exist, so if God exists, he just is those laws, then of course God exists. And then he says, well, what about the deist God? Is that a possibility as well? And then his point is that if I say I don't believe in God, then you've learned nothing. So a little bit all over the place.
Yeah, I'm not sure Cameron should be complaining about the communication skills of Carl, one of the most recognized science communicators, when he recaps like that. You're being a little long-winded, Cameron. You could have just said, when asked, do I believe in God, I need to know which version of the many gods you're talking about.
So a little bit all over the place, but what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I think what he's saying here is that concepts of God differ. Right. That is typical of the English language.
Right. Notice that Bill is agreeing with Carl, but the manner in which he's doing so suggests that he's about to follow up with a criticism.
Right.
And notice Cameron as he laughs and nods. All of this is narrative control.
That is typical of the English language. Take, for example, the word chair. There are different concepts of what a chair is. Does it have four legs? Does it have a back? Does it have arms? Is it padded? Is it collapsible? Depends on what kind of chair you're talking about.
Right. As if Carl didn't know this. To spell out what Carl has said, using Bill's chair analogy, if you ask me if I'm sat in a chair and I answer yes, that doesn't tell you anything about the chair I'm sitting on, especially if some philosophers were to define a chair as atoms in the universe, much like how some philosophers define God as to be so vague as the universe. Now, I wonder if Cameron would criticize Bill here for his very long-winded attempt to make a very simple point.
It's a very long-winded attempt at making a very basic point,
when Bill could have just referenced a book on Platonic forms.
More importantly, Cameron, think of the word science. There are many different definitions of what science is, but does that mean that the word is therefore useless? Well, obviously not. It just means that we need to clearly define our terms as we use them if we're to avoid misunderstanding.
Yeah, that actually raises a good point.
It doesn't raise a point, Cameron. It is Carl's point.
That actually raises a good point, because there's well-known terms that are discussed in philosophy, like knowledge, that it's like there's all sorts of different definitions that people have offered. People have, torn those definitions apart and everything. But if you say like, hey, I know that 2 + 2 = 4, it'd be kind of silly to be like, well, I've told you nothing if I said that, given the fact that there's all sorts of different definitions of
Sure.
what it means to know something. Yeah. Anything else to say before we move on to clip number 3?
I think that's enough.
So, despite mocking Carl as taking ages to make a very simple point, Cameron and Bill agree with his point, and thus they haven't actually provided any objection. But their tone and presentation suggest that they have. Not only this, they've exposed Carl as being ill-informed and poor at communication. This is what I mean by narrative control and optics, and their entire response to Carl is saturated with this apologetic method.
Right.
Now, some might say that this is just how disagreements unfold. We're all guilty of it, and so I'm being hypocritical by highlighting it. And I do, indeed, sarcastically slap people. However, it's not the cards being played, it's how they're played. That's the relevant difference. I'm upfront, and when I express a view that's unpopular, I'll tell you. If I disagree, I'll tell you I disagree. I don't hide it under a tone. If I agree, I don't pretend to disagree. But apologists hide behind a veneer of civility, obfuscating points, slyly undermining their opponents, all while pretending to engage in constructive, kind criticism. That's the key distinction here. It's not about the use of criticism or disagreement, it's about how transparently and honest these tools are wielded in the arena of debate and discussion. And in the realm of apologetics, as we've just seen, there's often more than meets the eye, and that's precisely why we need to be vigilant about it.